I think he's a great prime minister. I mean, he could represent me anytime. I will tell you, I'm not saying that because he is a very strong, very good leader.
In Washington, the cameras captured another handshake, another round of smiles inside the Oval Office. President Donald Trump praised his guest, Prime Minister Mark Carney, and the two leaders spoke of friendship and trade. But behind those polite gestures, the stakes could not be higher. For months, Trump's tariffs have tested the economic bond between the United States and Canada. What began as an attempt to force Ottawa into a new deal has now exposed cracks in America's own economy. Factories are slowing down, prices are climbing, and key U.S. states that depend on Canadian energy and materials are feeling the strain. The October 7 meeting between Trump and Carney was meant to reset relations. It ended without a formal deal, yet it marked a quiet turning point. Canada did not yield. Instead, it used patience, economic leverage, and a sense of shared purpose to turn American pressure into a form of power.
Let's be clear about the relationship as it stands right now. We are the second largest trading partner of the United States. We do a lot of trade going across the border. Secondly, we are the largest foreign investor in the United States. $500 billion in the last 5 years alone, probably $8 trillion in the next 5 years if we get the agreement that we expect to get.
Canadian materials are deeply woven into American supply chains. Ontario steel goes into Michigan car frames. Quebec aluminum powers jet parts assembled in Ohio. When the tariffs hit, costs for those same American factories spiked overnight. Construction firms in Texas and Florida reported higher material prices by late summer 2025. Furniture producers in North Carolina warned of job cuts as imported wood components became too expensive to source. Meanwhile, Canadian exports slowed but did not collapse. Many firms shifted their shipments to Europe and Asia under existing trade pacts, while Ottawa cushioned affected sectors with targeted support. By September, the U.S. Chamber of Commerce and several Great Lakes governors publicly urged Washington to reconsider. They argued that the tariffs were fueling inflation instead of reducing it. Inside Canada, the mood changed from frustration to resolve. The public saw that Trump's strategy was not breaking Ottawa's will, but exposing America's dependence on cross-border trade. The message became clear: the harder Washington squeezed, the more damage it caused to itself. Unlike the United Kingdom or the European Union, Canada cannot rely on distance to escape American policy shocks. The two nations share the world's longest undefended border, a 9,000-kilometer lifeline through which goods, energy, and investment flow every day. Carney reminded Americans of what that relationship means. Canada is their second-largest trading partner and their single largest foreign investor, with more than $500 billion invested over the past 5 years. If trade tensions ease, those investments could reach $8 trillion within the next 5 years, according to figures discussed by both governments. This level of integration gives Ottawa a different kind of strength. Ontario alone supplies electricity to states such as New York, Michigan, and Minnesota, helping to power factories, hospitals, and homes. When Trump's tariffs raised costs for those same regions, Canadian leaders quietly reminded local governors that their economic stability depends on cooperation, not confrontation. At the same time, Carney's government began shifting incentives toward domestic manufacturing. Companies producing steel and auto parts were encouraged to use off-peak electricity for cheaper power, effectively redirecting energy that once supported U.S. industry. The symbolism was striking. Canada could choose to keep the lights on south of the border or turn that current inward to strengthen its own factories. Trump wanted leverage, yet geography and integration meant Canada held most of it. While Washington operated in crisis mode, Ottawa projected calm. Carney faced intense domestic pressure to strike a deal, but he resisted the urge to retaliate with sweeping counter-tariffs. Instead, he pulled back Canada's planned digital services tax, a gesture of goodwill that reopened dialogue. This approach contrasted sharply with the mood in the United States. the federal government remained partly shut down due to budget stalemates. Inflation was rising, and investors faced uncertainty over shifting tariff lists. By comparison, Canada's fiscal position was stable. International agencies kept the country's AAA credit rating. Its debt-to-GDP ratio remained the lowest in the G7, and the Bank of Canada maintained steady interest rates even as global markets wavered. The contrast was not lost on financial analysts. Stability had become Canada's best diplomatic weapon. While Trump sought quick wins through public pressure, Carney built credibility quietly, aligning provincial premiers and business groups around a single goal: keep trade channels open and prevent panic. Even conservative figures who opposed Carney politically, such as former Minister Peter Mackay and Ontario Premier Doug Ford, acknowledged that the Prime Minister had to succeed for the sake of the national economy. The consensus was rare, and it strengthened Ottawa's hand. By the time the October meeting concluded, the US and Canada agreed to maintain technical talks and pause further escalation. No one declared victory, yet the silence itself spoke volumes. Carney had managed to turn confrontation into cooperation without conceding sovereignty. At the heart of the standoff lies a truth both sides cannot escape. The two economies are built together. More than 60% of components used in American auto assembly plants originate in Canada, according to North American industry data. Quebec's aluminum and Ontario's steel remain critical inputs for U.S. aviation and construction. When Trump revived his 51st state remark, many Canadians saw it as an insult, but others recognized it as proof of how intertwined the two nations have become. Each tariff, each soundbite only underscored that separation would harm both. This reality reshaped the political landscape in the Great Lakes region. Governors from states like Michigan and Wisconsin, home to millions of workers tied to cross-border trade, openly opposed further tariffs. They called for cooperation on steel, autos, and energy rather than escalation. Canada's strategy was to highlight this shared dependency without turning it into a public feud. Through joint industrial meetings and energy briefings, Ottawa quietly reminded U.S. officials that integrated grids, pipelines, and manufacturing corridors cannot be rebuilt elsewhere without enormous cost. In effect, the North American supply chain itself became Canada's shield. Every car part crossing the Detroit-Windsor Bridge, every megawatt of power flowing south served as living evidence that partnership, not punishment, is the only sustainable model. Trump's tariffs may have been loud, but Canada's integration was louder in practice. When the second Trump-Carney meeting ended, there was no new trade deal to announce, yet Canada walked away stronger than before. It had protected its industries from escalation, rallied bipartisan support at home, and earned sympathy from governors, investors, and even segments of the American business community. The U.S. administration may still hold the tariff lever, but Canada controls something more durable: trust, consistency, and the quiet backing of economic facts. Trump's strategy to pressure Ottawa has instead revealed how dependent Washington remains on its northern neighbor. The story that began as a test of strength is turning into a lesson in interdependence. In the long run, tariffs can be lifted or replaced, but the networks of energy, labor, and investment that bind these two nations cannot be unmade. Trump wanted a headline victory. Carney aimed for endurance. And as the lights of the Great Lakes continue to glow on both sides of the border, it is clear whose approach is keeping them on.
We are confident that the domestic pressure from senators, governors, business leaders, union leaders in the United States will also create potentially an opportunity for us to come to an agreement with the American administration.
Canada's Trade Minister Dominic LeBlanc has just delivered a message that cuts through the noise of tariffs, counter-tariffs, and political maneuvering. He declared that he is confident trade deals with the United States can still be reached. At first glance, it may sound optimistic, even overly so, given the hostile environment. But in truth, the statement is more than optimism. It is a sign that Canada sees leverage in a situation many assumed was stacked against it. This declaration comes at a time when Washington has unleashed some of the most aggressive trade measures in recent history. Under President Donald Trump's second term, tariffs have been applied broadly, with rates ranging from 10 to 50% on major partners. Canada has been hit particularly hard. Lumber, steel, aluminum, cabinets, and furniture are all facing steep duties as goods cross the border. These measures were supposed to pull jobs back to Detroit, Wisconsin, and Michigan, and showcase Trump as the dealmaker who could force allies to bend. Instead, they have set in motion forces that now threaten to undermine that very strategy.
Canada would not do what Japan, the EU, and others have done and settle for an across-the-board tariff from the U.S. in exchange for dropping sectoral tariffs leveled on softwood, steel, and aluminum.
When LeBlanc insisted Canada still has leverage, it was not bluster. His reasoning rests on the political and economic pain these tariffs are causing inside the United States. Governors, senators, business leaders, and union representatives are pressing the White House because they see the costs firsthand. Higher raw material prices are squeezing construction companies. Furniture makers in the Midwest are losing access to affordable inputs. Steel and aluminum duties are pushing up prices for auto parts and machinery. These ripple effects have made the tariffs a live issue in state capitals and in Congress. Ottawa has taken calculated steps in this environment. It rolled back many of its retaliatory tariffs to demonstrate a willingness to find common ground. Yet at the same time, Canada refused to strike a deal that mirrors what Japan or the European Union accepted. Those partners agreed to across-the-board tariff ceilings in exchange for relief on targeted products. Canada has drawn a different line. It insists that sector-specific duties on lumber, steel, and aluminum must be addressed directly.
And LeBlanc rejected the idea that protecting supply management, that's the system that shields dairy and poultry farmers in Canada from U.S. and foreign competition.
On top of this, Canada has stood firm in defending its supply management system. This policy, which shields dairy and poultry farmers from foreign competition, is described by the government as a cornerstone of food security and economic stability. LeBlanc's position is that it is non-negotiable. That message resonates domestically because it connects trade strategy to everyday life. Milk, cheese, and eggs are not abstract commodities. They are the products on kitchen tables across the country. Critics inside Canada have accused the government of weakness. Opposition leaders argue that promises of quick relief from tariffs have not been delivered. But when examined closely, Ottawa's stance is not weakness. It is a strategy of patience, relying on American domestic politics to do part of the work. The central irony of this trade conflict is that measures meant to squeeze Canada are now bouncing back on the United States. Consider the construction sector. Lumber tariffs of 10% layered on top of existing softwood duties are making homes more expensive to build. That matters in states where housing shortages are already severe. The furniture and cabinet tariffs, set to reach 25%, are another example. These costs are passed on to American consumers who already face higher living expenses. Retailers and importers are voicing frustration, and union leaders warn that prolonged tariffs could actually cost American jobs rather than save them. The auto industry illustrates the same pattern. Duties on Canadian steel and aluminum raise the price of components that U.S. factories rely on. Michigan and Ohio, states central to Trump's political coalition, are especially vulnerable. Companies are lobbying intensely, reminding policymakers that jobs depend on competitive supply chains, not just on national slogans. This is the first layer of backfire. Tariffs designed to force Canada to concede are fueling dissatisfaction at home. Senators and governors hear the complaints from businesses and workers in their districts. The White House may frame tariffs as a patriotic shield, but the daily reality of higher costs and delayed projects tells a different story. For Trump, the political stakes are high. He has built much of his image on being a master negotiator. Yet, if his strategy results in visible pain for American industries, his ability to claim victory weakens. The harder he pushes Canada, the more resistance builds inside his own borders. Beyond the short-term clash over tariffs lies a deeper shift. LeBlanc has said clearly that Canada's trade relationship with the United States will never return to what it once was. The days of assuming stability, of believing the rules of the Mulroney-Reagan or Clinton-Chrétien era still applied, are gone. This is not just rhetoric. It reflects a deliberate strategy to prepare Canada for a different future. LeBlanc describes this moment as a hinge, a turning point. Canada is using the pressure to accelerate diversification. By working with provinces, industries, and labor groups, the government is steering companies toward new partners. Europe has already signed on to a framework with the United States that caps tariffs, but Canada is looking to Europe for markets, not for concessions. Ottawa is also expanding ties with Indonesia, the United Kingdom, and Mexico. These relationships do not replace the American market overnight, but they gradually lessen dependence. The result is what LeBlanc calls a virtuous circle. The more Canadian businesses find success abroad, the less they are trapped by U.S. tariffs. With less dependency, Canada can negotiate with Washington on more balanced terms. And as that balance improves, it reinforces the incentive to diversify further. This is the second major backfire. Instead of tightening control over Canada, Trump's strategy has pushed his northern neighbor into building resilience. What was once a one-sided dependency is evolving into a network of options. The United States will remain Canada's largest trading partner, but no longer its only indispensable one. Dominic LeBlanc's confidence is not a promise of easy victories. It is an acknowledgement that Canada can endure and even adapt under pressure. The tariffs meant to isolate and weaken have instead opened paths for resilience. Trump's policies are producing two clear reversals. First, they are creating internal backlash in the United States, where businesses, unions, and local leaders are shouldering the costs. Second, they are pushing Canada to diversify, turning what was once a weakness into a strategic strength. The relationship between Canada and the United States has indeed changed forever. Tariffs are no longer just a negotiating tactic. They have become a catalyst for restructuring how two economies interact. Trump wanted to make America less dependent on foreign partners, but in the process, he has made Canada less dependent on America. That is why LeBlanc can speak with confidence. The path forward is not about restoring an old status quo. It is about shaping a new reality, where Canada negotiates from a firmer footing and where the United States must reckon with the unintended consequences of its own policies. The backfire is clear, and the lessons will echo in every round of trade talks to come.
We're going to talk about President Trump and a new wave of tariffs that he announced on Thursday, including a 100% levy on branded drug imports into the United States.
But starting today, the United States will no longer subsidize the health care of foreign countries where they paid a small fraction of what for the same drug that what we pay many, many times more for.
In late September, Washington delivered another shock to the global economy. President Donald Trump announced a 100% tariff on imported branded pharmaceuticals, alongside new duties of 50% on bathroom and kitchen cabinets, 30% on upholstered furniture, and 25% on heavy trucks. The decision takes effect on October 1st. On the surface, it looks like a dramatic push to bring manufacturing back home. Yet the question is unavoidable. The United States imports over $230 billion worth of pharmaceutical drugs each year, according to 2024 trade data. Canada is a critical partner in the North American drug supply chain. So how will Ottawa respond when tariffs threaten that foundation?
The European Pharmaceutical Industry's representative body saying that tariffs on medicines would create the worst of all worlds.
The impact abroad was immediate. In Brussels, the European pharmaceutical industry described the measure as the worst possible outcome. Markets across Asia reacted in real time. One leading Japanese drug company saw its shares fall by more than 4% on the day of the announcement, while Australia's CSL collapsed to a 6-year low. The carve-out that exempts companies already breaking ground on American facilities only added to the uncertainty. Investors were left to guess which producers would qualify and which would face a wall of tariffs. The wider concern is not limited to drug companies. Heavy trucks move goods through supply chains, so a new 25% duty risks pushing costs into the daily products American families buy. Furniture and cabinet imports, still dominated by Asian producers, will now carry higher price tags. Trump framed the entire package as a national security measure, but the ripple effects spread far beyond the United States. Allies who once counted on predictable access to the American market now confront sudden barriers, and confidence in long-term planning is shaken.
In the more immediate lens, Carney says he spoke with U.S. President Donald Trump earlier this week in New York, that meeting coming around the same time Washington imposed tariffs on pharmaceutical goods.
We are, we're engaged with the U.S. In ongoing discussions on some of those specific strategic areas. Those conversations are ongoing. I had a higher level conversation with the president a few days ago.
For Canada, the timing was critical. Prime Minister Mark Carney had just met Trump in New York days before the tariff order was unveiled. He confirmed that pharmaceuticals were part of those high-level discussions. Rather than react with anger, Ottawa moved to position itself for the broader challenge. The government launched consultations ahead of the 2026 review of the Canada-United States-Mexico Agreement. Businesses, lawmakers, and communities are now being asked to shape the agenda for the next phase of North American trade. The goal is to prevent disputes like the pharmaceutical shock from erupting on a case-by-case basis. At the same time, Canada is diversifying. Carney's trip to the United Kingdom and his signing of a free trade agreement with Indonesia show that Ottawa is building new links abroad. Yet the core strategy is to keep the American relationship within a structured framework. By strengthening CUSMA, Canada seeks to anchor its industries against unilateral tariff storms. Health Canada has been monitoring potential disruptions in pharmaceutical supply, while Canadian industry groups such as Innovative Medicines Canada and neighborhood pharmacies have warned about risks to patient access. This combination of domestic vigilance and diplomatic preparation abroad reflects a deliberate approach that balances immediate needs with long-term positioning. For ordinary Canadians, the message is clear. The country is not standing still. It is preparing for negotiations that will define jobs and investment for years to come. Trump's tariffs were designed to force others to bend. Instead, they have prompted allies to shield themselves, and in Canada's case, to prepare an organized defense. 100% duty on drugs may look like toughness in Washington, but it risks higher costs for American patients while partners adapt through planning and alliances. The European Union has drawn a line. Asia has seen share prices tumble, and Canada has turned the moment into a rallying call for the CUSMA review. The paradox is striking. The more Washington raises the stakes, the more its neighbors and allies search for stability elsewhere. Canada's counterplay shows that even a smaller partner can use trade structures to protect its interests. As October begins, the real question is not whether Trump can impose tariffs. It is whether those tariffs will leave America isolated while others learn to navigate around them.
Prime Minister Mark Carney is continuing his globe-trotting search for trade and investment today. And this morning in Ottawa, the Prime Minister hosted his counterpart from Ireland.
This is one of our strongest relationships, culturally, economically, with respect to shared values in foreign policy.
Across the Atlantic, a striking message is taking shape. Ireland's Prime Minister has called aligning with Canada the obvious choice under U.S. tariffs. On the same day, Canadian Prime Minister Mark Carney left Ottawa for London to meet leaders of the United Kingdom, Spain, and Denmark. These two developments might look routine, but together they highlight something bigger. Washington's tariff campaign, designed to bring partners closer, is instead nudging them to look elsewhere. Since early September, the Trump administration has enforced its reciprocal tariff regime, removing duty-free treatment for small imports, adding surcharges on heavy trucks, and announcing a 100% tariff on branded pharmaceuticals effective October 1st. The European Union, already under a 15% ceiling on auto and parts exports to the U.S., is recalculating its options. And one of its member states, Ireland, has chosen to say the quiet part out loud. Ireland's relationship with Canada is not new. Under the provisional application of CETA, their trade has doubled over the past 7 years. The Irish government has now pledged to ratify the agreement formally this year and to send a high-level trade mission across the Atlantic. For Dublin, the motivation is clear. U.S. tariffs hit pharmaceuticals hard, a sector worth tens of billions annually to Ireland's economy. By tightening links with Canada, Irish policymakers are hedging against instability in their largest market. The relationship is not only about exports. Irish leaders have invited Canadian firms to bid on major infrastructure, such as the new metro system planned for Dublin. At the same time, Irish companies see opportunities in Canada's own large-scale infrastructure spending, from public transit to energy. Yes, there are barriers, including interprovincial trade frictions and regulatory complexity, but both governments are acknowledging them and working to streamline. With Ireland set to hold the EU Council presidency in the latter half of 2026, the political signal is powerful. Canada gains a friend with influence inside the European system at precisely the moment when Washington's approach is generating uncertainty. The Irish declaration matters not only in bilateral terms. When a mid-sized EU economy frames Canada as an obvious hedge, it legitimizes a wider realignment. Carney's meetings in London and continental capitals are part of this pattern. Countries are not waiting for tariff relief from Washington. They are writing new playbooks. Even though the US-EU framework capped most tariffs at 15%, the uncertainties surrounding Trump's policy makes diversification rational. Firms and governments prefer predictability, and right now predictability is easier to find in channels linking Europe and Canada. For the United States, this amounts to an erosion of leverage. The original goal of the tariff strategy was to pull investment and supply chains back to U.S. soil. Instead, Washington is seeing partners deepen ties with each other, often with Canada in the middle. What was meant to concentrate trade is diffusing it. For American consumers and industries, the consequences are already visible. Higher tariffs on home goods, furniture, and trucks risk pushing prices upward. The pharmaceutical surcharge may create pressure if domestic production capacity does not expand quickly enough. Meanwhile, the longer-term effect is that contracts, capital, and joint ventures are landing in Canada and Europe instead of the United States. Ireland's formal ratification of CETA and its upcoming trade mission will be milestones to watch. So will the results of Carney's European tour and any follow-on agreements between Canada and the UK. For U.S. policymakers, the lesson is straightforward. Tariffs can redirect trade flows, but not always toward their intended destination. In this case, the Ireland-Canada pivot shows that pressure designed to reinforce America's centrality is instead encouraging allies to stitch together alternatives. The real scoreboard will not be speeches, but investment decisions, export shares, and supply chain maps in the quarters ahead.